The American city cannot blossom in lawlessness. And this week, well, we're doing a deep dive into the aggressive legal and policy counterpunch to political violence and urban disorder that's really dominating the conversation right now.
That's right. And our sources for this deep dive, they're intensely focused really on one main goal, the immediate restoration of law and order.
Yeah.
And specifically through robust federal intervention and, the strategic use of some very powerful, maybe even unprecedented legal tools.
So our mission today, yours and ours, is to unpack this growing tension. It's between, highly charged political rhetoric on one side and the very real street-level violence we're seeing on the other. We're looking into the new conservative strategy designed to combat what they're framing as, well, organized political agitation.
And the event that really pushed this whole conversation to a crisis point, it happened just recently, September 10th.
We are talking about the assassination of conservative figure Charlie Kirk. And this tragedy, it happened just after he had publicly designated the movement known as Antifa as a terrorist organization.
That incident really anchored the entire discussion on how the federal government should respond. Respond to politically motivated violence.
And the sources, they reveal that the suspect, Tyler Robinson, was apparently radicalized, displayed, quote, multiple warning signs leading up to the shooting.
Right.
But the reaction, wow, that truly crystallizes the polarization we're dealing with. You actually have figures celebrating that Kirk's voice was silenced.
It's stark. One headline we saw even asked, happy that his voice was silenced, why more college kids are embracing political violence. This kind of rhetoric, it really shows the severity of the threat being perceived by the administration. They see the Kirk assassination not as, some isolated crime, but as the inevitable outcome of unchecked radical left-wing political groups. And the federal government, they've responded forcefully since then, deploying the National Guard, for instance, to deal with unrest in sanctuary cities and kicking off these massive anti-crime interventions in places like Washington, D.C.
Okay. So let's unpack this escalation then. We need to understand the narrative here, how they're connecting these individual acts of violence to the bigger policy response.
Well, Charlie Kirk's death on September 10th, it happened while he was at Utah Valley University for his American Comeback Tour.
Right.
And it immediately became a flashpoint. Voices aligned with the administration, they instantly framed it. One source put it bluntly, modern left-wing terrorist organizations killed Kirk. The framing is severe, and that's deliberate.
And to make the case that this isn't isolated, that it's a pattern, the sources we looked at connect this tragedy to other high-profile, politically motivated threats.
Exactly. The narrative they're pushing is one of a sustained, escalating threat. They point specifically to the attempted assassination plot against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh.
I remember that.
Yeah, where the suspect allegedly wanted to kill multiple justices explicitly to try and preserve Roe v. Wade. And they also cite the ABC station shooting. The suspect there, described as politically motivated, left a chilling note warning Trump officials they're next.
So when you look at those examples, that's high-level political targeting. But the sources also seem to connect this breakdown of order to, well, everyday life, arguing these same forces are at play everywhere.
That's the crucial bridge in their narrative, yeah. They argue that if you tolerate high-level ideological violence, general disorder just follows. So they highlight global examples, like from Georgia, a deadly Savannah apartment shooting, a killing at an Augusta mall, a man murdered during a barbershop robbery. The argument is basically the problem is widespread, it's pervasive, and it needs an aggressive top-down strategy to restore safety everywhere.
And that aggressive strategy brings us right to the legal hammer being deployed, or well, at least strongly suggested against activist groups, the Archeo Act. President Trump had already designated Antifa as a terrorist organization. Now it looks like the government might be preparing to use the legal equivalent of a bunker buster, the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act.
Yeah, and this is where the strategy gets really interesting and, frankly, unprecedented in this context. RICO was created, decades ago? To take down the mafia, other traditional organized crime groups.
Right, traditional syndicates.
Now the administration is looking at applying this very same statute to decentralized political protest organizations. Legal expert Balboni emphasized RICO is a very powerful tool precisely because it targets the enterprise itself.
Not just the individual acts.
Exactly, not just isolated acts of violence.
So how do you actually argue that a decentralized group, activists often masked, how do you argue that constitutes a unified enterprise under the law? That sounds like, well, a huge legal leap.
It is a leap, definitely. But Balboni outlined the 3 key things prosecutors would need to prove. First, the existence of an enterprise. And importantly, it doesn't need to be formally incorporated, just a group of people associated, in fact.
Okay.
Second, they need to show a pattern of racketeering activity. Think arson, extortion, assault, things like that, linked to the group's goals over the last 10 years.
Okay, a pattern.
And third, they have to show the threat of continued criminal behavior exists.
Yeah.
That it wasn't just a one-off thing.
So if they can prove that, what happens? Why is Reichel so much more devastating, say, than just prosecuting individuals for vandalism or assault?
Well, it allows for what Balboni called an enterprise-wide roll-up.
Right.
This lets prosecutors link actions across state lines, actions that might otherwise seem isolated. And critically, it allows for seizing assets, targeting funding streams.
The money.
Exactly, and charging higher-level organizers, people who maybe never threw a punch themselves, but, facilitated the ongoing criminal activity. For a decentralized group that relies on funding and coordination, that's potentially existential.
That is a profound difference. It means the government's taking existing laws and, like you said, successfully wrapping it around the concept of political agitation, civil disruption. But doesn't this approach risk criminalizing legitimate political dissent?
That is the core question this whole strategy raises, isn't it? However, the conservative viewpoint, at least as presented in these sources, it suggests that when groups advocate, say, overthrowing the U.S. or using violence to push their agenda, they basically forfeit any claim to legitimate political dissent. Balboni was quoted saying it's hard to find sympathy for a group advocating violence.
I see.
So the administration's strategic calculation seems to be that the political win from restoring order outweighs the inevitable legal fights about free speech.
This aggressive legal stance, it's mirrored by direct federal action on the ground too, right? Let's shift to that. The huge deployment of federal agencies into high-crime areas, starting with Washington, D.C.
Yeah, this intervention is framed very specifically as fixing local governance failures. Our sources point out that old accusations are resurfacing about D.C. police, maybe manipulating or distorting violent crime stats.
Oh, really?
Yeah, with a commander reportedly suspended over it. So this narrative of local inadequacy, it's used to justify the federal anti-crime push.
And the results, at least according to the sources we read, they've been dramatic.
Apparently so. Federal arrests in D.C. have passed 100 since this crackdown started. And the D.C. police chief himself publicly praised the federal takeover, saying it helped round up dangerous suspects. Yeah. And this focus on immediate, tangible results, that's critical to the administration's messaging. One source even highlighted a pretty remarkable outcome. D.C. reportedly had a murder-free week right after the intervention began.
A murder-free week.
Yeah, that metric serves as powerful evidence for their claim that swift federal action can curb rising urban violence, right away.
And this federal response, it doesn't just stop at the capital city. It extends pretty robustly, it seems, into sanctuary jurisdictions dealing with anti-IC protests and what they call persistent lawlessness.
That's right. The sources document deploying the National Guard to Los Angeles. That was after anti-IC riots that included significant looting.
Okay.
The administration's policy here is pretty clear. Sanctuary city status isn't going to shield you from federal law enforcement when public order breaks down.
And the numbers backing this up, they sound kind of staggering. IC is pursuing massive enforcement actions. Reports say agents are deporting over 1,400 illegal immigrants a day.
Yeah, over 1,400 a day. That's a huge policy shift, prioritizing enforcement over, say, processing backlogs.
Wow.
Absolutely. And just to put that in perspective, there was this one 6-week initiative just in Georgia called Operation No Escape. That one operation resulted in 177 arrests. It really shows the massive scale of this shift, emphasizing federal power to enforce border and immigration laws, directly pushing back against local sanctuary policies.
So this broad policy shift, this conservative counter-revolution we're talking about, it isn't just law enforcement and immigration. We're seeing it reflected in cultural and other policy battles, too.
We are, yeah. For example, the Supreme Court clearing the path for the administration to cancel diversity, equity, and inclusion DEI grants at the National Institutes of Health.
Right, the NIH grant.
And at the same time, the Department of Education found Denver Public Schools violated Title IX regulations with their specific policy on all gender restrooms. These actions, whether they're legal rulings or regulatory findings, they really reinforce the administration's administration's overall policy direction, moving away from progressive agendas that, in their view, enable chaos and division.
Okay, so let's try to sum this up. We've covered the whole spectrum here. We've seen the administration's narrative connecting, well, toxic political rhetoric to specific tragic acts of violence like the Kirk assassination.
Right.
And we've detailed the determined federal response using these powerful, aggressive legal tactics like the RETL Act, plus massive federal intervention in both high-crime areas and sanctuary cities.
Yeah, and the core insight, I think, is watching how a government strategy can successfully take what's seen as a socio-political challenge, whether it's Antifa or just, widespread urban lawlessness,
Right.
and completely reframe it as an actionable, organized criminal enterprise. And using these powerful, decades-old organized crime laws to do it, that fundamentally changes the definition of political opposition itself.
It really changes the calculation for activist groups, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The government is leveraging tools literally designed for the mafia against political groups advocating civil disruption, sometimes violence. So this raises the critical question for you, the listener,
Yeah.
as you watch these strategies unfold.
Yeah.
When the law starts defining political agitation as an ongoing criminal enterprise, does that fight for law and order fundamentally change the whole landscape of political dissent in America?
That's the question.
Definitely something to consider as we watch these aggressive new strategies continue to play out.